my specific interest in human rights is that I was for many years a senior judge, firstly in England and Wales, and then in the United Kingdom generally. And that coincided with the implementation of the Human Rights Act 1998. So I played quite a considerable part in the training of the judiciary before the implementation of that act, and then, of course, in deciding quite a lot of rather important cases about the act. So I could scarcely fail to be interested in it.
Human rights are a way of describing the universal character of humanity. At present, many people don't relate to this. Fear, division, and lack of knowledge get in the way. Why do you think that is?
I think two sources are mostly to blame, one of which has traditionally been the media, because certain sections of the legacy media in particular fairly quickly started referring to the hated Human Rights Act. I believe that the reason for that was that for the very first time, the Human Rights Act enabled the courts to develop a wrong of misuse of private information. In other words, to protect privacy. The press had, of course, long enjoyed themselves invading other people's privacy, publishing the most salacious details about people, and they didn't like that no longer being possible. That's one reason. Though it has to be said that when it suits them, the media are perfectly happy to take advantage of the protection of freedom of expression, which is contained in the Human Rights Convention. The second has been certain politicians in now, I regret to say, at least 2 and possibly 3 political parties who blame the European Human Rights Convention and the Human Rights Act for the problems that we suffer in relation to migration, specifically the deportation of foreign national criminals, and much more recently and dramatically, the increasing numbers, although they're not increasing at the moment, but they have been visibly increasing, of illegal migrants. And for some reason, which I find very difficult to understand, they blame the European Convention for those problems. I could expand upon that because it seems to me to be totally misguided. And in any event, it's very subject focused. So the solution cannot be to throw out the baby with the bathwater. If you want to throw out the bathwater, just make sure you save the baby.
Can you offer some practical steps to help people recognize their own human rights, to respect the rights of others, and understand that human rights are in fact universal?
That's a very big question, and I think it's the most difficult one to answer. What I would like to see is a great deal more education about the Constitution, the machinery of government, the relationship between Parliament, government, and the courts, and the place which fundamental rights plays in that. It's something that in most other countries is taken for granted as part of the primary school curriculum, because most other countries have a written constitution, and so they feel it essential to educate their citizenry and residents in that constitution. We have never felt that necessary, but I feel that it is. And that's where I'd like to start, in schools, with a lovely children's book illustrating what human rights and the essentials of the Constitution are all about. And it could so easily be done. Also, I saw when I visited Wales some time ago that in Wales, quite apart from the obligations on government to consider children's rights whenever they have a policy decided, there are schools in Wales that are children's rights schools. And so they teach the little children about the whole idea of rights, including, of course, some of the most basic ones. I watched 5 and 6 year olds enacting a little play which was all about the right to an identity, the right to a name. Now, we take that for granted in this country because births have to be registered, and I suspect that almost all of them are, although I don't know the answer to that question. But it's clearly the most fundamental right, apart from the right to life, is to be identified as a person and counted amongst the people. And there are plenty of places in the world where that doesn't happen. So teaching children about the need for an identity, which, of course, because they're then talking about their names, and so on, they realize that there's a reciprocity to this. And although human rights are enforced as rights against the state, or rights that the state must observe, clearly, if everybody's got those rights, other people have to observe them as well. So there's a reciprocity to it, which again comes out of this whole primary education. Those are the two sorts of things that I would like to happen. Obviously, the more we had easily accessible materials about it, I mean, on the whole, the books for adults, they're either textbooks about human rights, really the sort of thing that I've got and I read and so on, which is all very well necessary for the lawyers amongst us and for some politicians, no doubt, and government. But it would, I don't know, you may know, I don't know of a nice little handbook of actually the European Convention on Human Rights and what you can do to enforce or assert those rights in UK law. I don't know of a nice little handbook doing that. And I feel that there ought to be one. And other things as well, but that would be so obvious. The straightforward thing is to ask people to go and read it, because the European Convention is not difficult to read, and at least it would give you some idea of what it contains, and particularly if you're discussing it with somebody who's very skeptical because of what they have read in the media or listened to from the politicians. Going through it and saying, well, how much of this do you object to? What's wrong with this? What's wrong with that? And so on. And so people like us have to have chats about it, don't we, as well? If we encounter skeptics, we have to try and put across what it's all about.
So our understanding of human rights adapts to the condition of the world at any time. How would you describe the evolution of human rights over the past 75 years?
Well, of course, some people would object to the first part of your statement. They would object to the idea that human rights have to adapt over time. There is a view, one of the criticisms of the European Court of Human Rights is that it has treated the convention as a living instrument. Now, this is not a radical idea in constitutional interpretation. It is a general principle of constitutional interpretation, certainly in this country, and I think in other countries too, that constitutional instruments have to be given a broad and purposive construction, which will necessarily move with the times. It was the Constitution of Canada, which the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in this country described as a living tree, capable of growth and development, but within its natural limits. In other words, you can't go anywhere with it. It has to come from the material in the tree, but within that material, it can grow. So, yes, of course, it has to grow. And quite a lot of things have happened over the last 75 years. one of the things that I think is very important was the recognition that distinguishing between children born to parents who were or were not married to one another, in the recognition of their rights to respect for their family lives, was contrary to the convention. Now, that was quite controversial when it was first decided. The UK judge at the time dissented from that conclusion. He didn't think that the convention was about the rights of babies. Of course, that in itself is a monstrous thing to say, because it's about the rights of people throughout their lives, not just for their babies, and their right to have their natural links with the people to whom they are related, recognised in law. It's such a basic thing. So that's one of my prime examples of good that has happened through the convention. There are a lot of other examples too. I mean, the whole privacy thing is important, but the recognition that discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation in relation to the rights guaranteed in the convention is wrong. That's also been one of the major advances that has been motivated by the convention. So that's just two examples.
What can we learn from the pioneers of modern human rights after the Second World War?
I think the main thing that we can learn from the pioneers of human rights after the Second World War, well, is firstly why they thought it was so important, and secondly, who many of them were. So why they thought it was so important was that the world, and Europe in particular, had emerged from a period of totalitarian government in much of Europe. And of course, as Winston Churchill put it, an iron curtain had descended over Europe, which meant that totalitarian government was going to persist in Eastern Europe. So they thought it very important to band together the original members of the Council of Europe, to band together to make a statement of those basic fundamental human rights which those states vowed, agreed, legally bindingly in international law to protect. So that was the major motivation. Of course, the same had happened with the Universal Declaration of the United Nations in earlier, but the Universal Declaration was not a binding instrument. And turning it into binding instruments took until 1966, when it was probably rather too late. Whereas in 1950, when Europe did it, this was the first binding instrument. Very important. The second thing that it teaches us is that this isn't or shouldn't be a party political issue. I mentioned Winston Churchill. He was a great supporter of the Council of Europe. I must, of course, mention David Maxwell Fyfe, who became Lord Kilmuir, who was one of the lawyers who was instrumental in the drafting of the original convention. And of course, he was a very convinced conservative. And indeed, there is some evidence that the Attlee government, which was in power in 1950, was a bit sceptical about the idea of human rights, which these days would be surprising to people. But of course, they were converted because of all the things that it actually could do for the people that they cared most about. I'm not suggesting they didn't care about everybody, but cared most about. So those are two very obvious things that the early days teach us.
What would be your principal objectives for a programme to educate future generations in human rights?
Well, my principal objective for a programme to educate people about human rights would actually be to have a programme to educate people about human rights, which is how I started this conversation, because we haven't yet got that objective. It's important that we should have it. I believe it's important that the major institutions in the country should reaffirm the importance of human rights. And I think that should be the case in the courts, and it should be the case in Parliament, should be the case in government. But it should also be the case throughout our education system. My experience talking to young people, and I do talk with quite a large number of young people, either university students or sometimes years 12 and 13 school students. And my impression from them is that they are all enthusiastic about the idea of human rights. They don't see it as a threat to the values they hold dear. They see it as a reinforcement of the values that they hold dear. So I'm not sure that I see the problem so much in the younger generation, although I do think more education is necessary, because, of course, the people I'm talking to are people who know something about the subject. I have a horrible feeling that the problem lies more in the older generations in this country. And people who, for example, are prepared to talk about the European Court of Human Rights as being a foreign court. And the whole word foreign, of course, is triggering for some people. But it isn't a foreign court. It's an international court, the product of a treaty, which is an international contract between the member states of the Council of Europe, who said, this is what we believe in, this is what we all agree to protect, and this is the mechanism that we agree is there to protect it. It's a deal. We've got good things out of it, and so we should also contribute to that deal.
Could we do more to secure human rights? What is the single most important thing that could be done to ensure human rights are secured?
The most important thing that we could do to ensure that human rights are secured